On today's PMEA's Take Note podcast, we are talking about small ensembles that you can do in your music programs with somebody who does it for a living. On today's PMEA's Take Note podcast. Well, everybody, and welcome to this edition of Take Note. I'm Mark Despotakis. Thanks for being here with us. So today we are joined by someone that you may have seen if you were at a PME conference several years ago, if you've been involved in the Crescendo Student Conference in the past couple years, because groups that she performs in have been part of that. So let me welcome in Kara LaMoure, who is a professional musician from several groups, and we're going to talk about those groups and these wonderful small ensembles that they are. Kara, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you. That we actually got you when you're sitting still for a few minutes, because I know that you are constantly on tour with these groups that you're in.
Yes, and I was bummed to miss the Crescendo Conference live component this year. So I performed at Crescendo this year with the Breaking Winds, but actually I had to miss the live part because I was on a plane going to a tour for WindSync, my wind quintet.
So we're going to hear about what both of those groups are coming up in a minute. But yeah, if you were part of Crescendo and you saw what the Breaking Winds did, it was awesome. They had a concert for us, and then we had a live component, and we did miss you there. But now we get you for an extended period of time today to ask you some questions and talk with you. So let's start by kind of level setting a little bit. Tell us the who is Kara story, your background kind of in music.
Sure. So I am a bassoonist, and my professional specialty, I guess I would say, is chamber music, small ensemble music. But I came up probably in a way that's familiar to a lot of our listeners today, which is through my public band program at my middle school and then high school growing up. I grew up in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. So I'm from Plano, Texas specifically. Started bassoon in 6th grade in my middle school with a really wonderful band director teaching actually beginning double reeds, which is really special. And I know that not everybody has access to that. So I feel very lucky to have had that foundation. Going up in high school through my high school band program, I really loved marching band. But of course, as a bassoonist, I was doing color guard. I was not marching bassoon. Okay. Also very involved in youth orchestra. And before that, actually, before bassoon ever was part of my life, doing some other youth music programs that I thought were really cool, like children's choir, piano lessons. I have lots of fond memories of all of those. And those were all very foundational in making me the musician who I am now. I went to the Eastman School of Music for my undergraduate degree. And then I did a graduate degree, a master's at Northwestern University. So I was in the Midwest actually for about 10 years after having grown up in Texas. And being a bit of a freelance musician in Chicago was also formative to me. Listening to the Chicago Symphony was amazing, and I fell in love with orchestral music even more than I already had been, and still think it's amazing repertoire. Northwestern also has a really strong wind ensemble band program, so I got to still tap into some of that part of my background. But by then, I was already working with the Breaking Winds. We had met as undergraduate students at the Eastman School of Music, and basically we would play bassoon quartets together after studio class, after bassoon class, and our teacher would let us go into his office, and we first started playing music by some bassoon quartets we had heard, who actually formed in the 60s and 70s, the Bubonic Bassoon Quartet, and it's kind of like following iterations, the Bubonic Trio and all those guys. We were playing their music and loved it, and it kind of blew up and became our own creative project, and we kept arranging for the group and creating new ways to play music as a bassoon quartet, and ultimately kind of went pro after undergrad. So by the time I was in Chicago, I had that piece of my puzzle already in place. I didn't realize it would lead to actually kind of a career as a chamber musician, but I'm totally delighted that it did. From Chicago, I went and took a full-time teaching position for a couple of years. I was the professor at the University of Missouri, and that was really cool because it was compatible actually with the life of a performing and touring musician. So that's something to know, that a career in music can have many different components. But while I was there, I had the opportunity then to join another ensemble, which is the Wind Quintet WindSync. And with my two ensembles, I was then able to take the leap into performing being a very heavily represented chunk of my career portfolio. So I moved to Houston, which is where WindSync is based. I've been in Houston for upwards of 7 years now, which is crazy to think. And I do a lot of different creative projects and chamber music projects as a bassoonist.
So I want to dive into WindSync and Breaking Winds a little bit more, but I like the piece of trivia that we got here, because this was actually one of my follow-up questions. That okay, you were you were playing bassoon all through middle school and high school, but what did you do during marching band season? So that was interesting to hear that you did the color guard and didn't play the saxophone or something. Interesting.
I loved color guard. Shout out to all my color guard people. It's not an instrument, so people aren't thinking about it as much, but it is just as musical, obviously physically demanding, and I love to dance. So that was a really great and appropriate outlet for my dancing energy in school.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, listeners of this podcast know that we sneak some marching band reference somehow into every episode. So I'm glad that you did it for me without me having to do it first. So let's go back to the Breaking Winds. I want to kind of unpack that story a little bit more. I mean, so here, yeah, that's great. You all kind of come together and play some fun stuff, if you will, and have a really good time with it and making this, these fun arrangements that you found. But then it really grew to, okay, we're going to do our own arrangements, and then we're going to have this really fun video component, and we're going to do fun things like add a kazoo or some boom whackers into what you do. I mean, what's that process like? Because if for folks who weren't at Crescendo, the four of you are all across the country now, but you've managed to keep this working. What is that? How does it work now, I guess, is my question after all of that.
Sure. I think we're building upon a foundation that we laid when we were together and when we were students, which is wild to think about. We've all grown and come into our own as performers and in our careers, but those days of just being together in our studio and trying to figure things out together was kind of that formative period when we kind of actually started playing some of the pieces we still play now, actually. And the way that we make it work now is that we have a long relationship, which, unfortunately, someone who isn't in college yet, they only have the opportunity to have a relationship of about, as long as they've played their instrument, which I know it feels like a long time, but it's actually quite short in the grand scheme of things. We've come to realize as we started in college and now have taken it out into our careers, that as we get to know each other as people and learn to work together outside of music, our musical collaboration gets richer and deeper and more interesting. And that's been super fascinating. Something else that's really been amazing for us in like growing and changing is that since we have been apart since we were in graduate school, we've lived in all different cities. We've all started to figure out our own approach to the bassoon and to music, and we all have our different equipment that we like and our different technical ideas. So now when we come together, we can actually help each other in that same way we did when we were first playing together. We have these new different ideas that we've come to independently that weren't just from our teacher, which is kind of cool. So not only is the music, the creative aspect, something that we do all in-house and that is all driven by what do we like to play and what do we want to play next year and what would just be fun for this group. It's also this, there's also this aspect of we have this like newness and creative excitement around our discoveries on the bassoon. Because yeah, you're right. We aren't together all that often. We're together a few times a year. And so we have to always come back together and see, okay, like, what are we sounding like right now? And like, what's your latest idea about music, and what do you want to play?
So, as we saw in Crescendo, and folks, if they weren't a Crescendo, can go to the breakingwinds.com and find out, more information, see some of these videos. But you're doing music videos to these things. And, like, you're producing this yourself, right? This is not, they're, bringing in some studio to produce all of this for you. I mean, you guys are doing most of this yourself, right?
Yes. Oh, completely.
Which blows my mind, because as I watch them, I'm like, well, no, they're not just using an iPhone to do this. But Yuki said that you are just using an iPhone to do most of these, which is just so incredible. So there's this other creative piece to it. It's now, I guess it kind of just keeps morphing, and it's so fun. And I just love the Breaking Winds. A new album just came out.
Yes, a new album, and our accompanying sheet music book will be out
Okay,
soon too.
that's
Which,
awesome.
yeah, which is cool. I mean, the thing is, the bassoon quartet was never a real thing, right? Like, the string quartet is hundreds of years old, or I play in a wind quintet. That's a genre that's hundreds of years old, but composers through history haven't been writing bassoon quartets, and I don't blame them. Bassoons are unusual, and where are you going to find four of them in your town? But that means that we're just kind of making it up as we go, and yeah, so we get drawn in all sorts of creative directions. And I do think the music video thing, and adding sheet music to our CD, just anything that's different, is because we're just thinking, well, this is all brand new. So if we're making it all up, what do we want it to be like?
Yeah, that's so awesome. Okay, so I'm gonna come back to that point a little bit later when we're talking about small ensembles in schools. But I'm gonna hear a little bit more about WindSync.
Okay.
So in some ways, like, to me, I look at this as, boy, that's a really major leap of faith on your part to go to Texas, to essentially be, I mean, like, to commit to this in that full-time way, to move there. You're traveling a lot with this group. This group is playing, a lot of serious, if you will, for lack of the right term, serious. I guess we'll say serious based on, from what you're doing in the Breaking Winds when you're playing Lady Gaga. And to your previous point, there's music out there that's already written for this type of ensemble. But there is obviously a demand then for this type of ensemble around the country, as much as you're touring.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we are very lucky to work as much as we do in WindSync, because, again, it's still not the perfect mainstream of the orchestra with the conductor, or the string quartet that we're used to seeing in chamber music. So I'm really grateful to my colleagues who worked on the WindSync project for about 7 or so years before I even joined, and got a lot of that set up. But what's exciting about WindSync is, as long as you can get butts in the seats, as long as you can get audience members to show up to the hall and hear one of our concerts, the feedback is astonishing, because it turns out most people have never heard a wind quintet. For a bassoonist, it's actually kind of surprising, because wind quintet is how we're grouped if we're studying chamber music when we're younger. So I definitely did that a little bit in high school, and then it's required in college for a music degree. So for me, it's like, oh yeah, this is just wind quintet. For an audience member who's never heard it before, it's like a worldview changing sort of listening experience, because most people have seen the wind instruments in the back of an ensemble, most likely in the back of their symphony, but can't necessarily parse through what the individual sounds are. And suddenly, when you have this, like, brash, bold, wildly different set of instruments directly in front of you, you're kind of bombarded with all these different sounds: the French horn, flute, oboe, clarinet, and bassoon. And you can kind of tell the distinct characteristics of each one. You're hearing them blend, and you're hearing them create exciting music together, but you're also just kind of constantly being drawn to the different sounds. I think it's a really cool audience experience. At least this is, the feedback we tend to get. So yeah, the most common comment is, "Oh, I didn't expect to like this as much as I did." Tough for the marketing department, but pretty amazing after the concert.
Right, right. Well, so to that point, when the Breaking Winds was at PMEA several years ago, you all did a session, a professional development session, and it was about this idea of small ensembles. And I was at the session, and I kind of walked away with a whole different perspective. Because obviously I think you it's fair to say you find incredible value in small ensembles, and there's an incredible value for them in schools. And I think a lot of music teachers might not think about that, and might think, oh, okay, that this might be too complicated for us to do. This might not be something that we have time to do, or that we can make achieve at such a high level as maybe our concert band or orchestra is. I mean, I'm then curious, what are your thoughts on small ensembles in schools to really, I would say, help build the whole program?
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And I feel like at that session, I was definitely feeling really passionate that, like, small ensembles are the key and, like, they have to happen. And as I've gone through the professional world and seen all the challenges that band directors are dealing with on a excuse me, on a daily basis, trying to schedule everything in, um, I think my evolution on this thought is actually just that small ensemble skills are what make us into the musicians we are. So if students can participate in small ensembles, like I remember when I was in high school, we had solo and ensemble contests, but we had to be very independent in order to make it work. And we didn't yet have those skills. Um, so yeah, having students either like write their own program notes, introduce their own works, perform their ensemble piece in front of a group. These things actually, I think, are building that like independence and artistic mindset for students. But the other like kind of, I guess, newer thought that I have is that small ensemble skills, because they are so critical, can and should be built even within the context of the band. So I've noticed recently, if I go in with one of my ensembles and we're clinicking a band, students are really uncomfortable showing musical leadership. And by that, I mean either like cueing each other or playing a phrase in a creative way and trying to mimic each other, or listening down the row. All of these things actually could pretty quickly be taught, because when we go in and do a session, we're kind of forcing them to, hopefully in a gentle and open way. But you can pull a trio out of your band, like, okay, let's have the tuba here and this French horn and this flute and this saxophone. Why don't you guys now perform this excerpt of our band music? And it's amazing to see how quickly students will get together and have that group think and listen for each other, the musical ESP, once they're asked to show leadership in this way. As a bassoonist, I think that's super important, because in band class, I always just kind of sat back, and I feel like a lot of band periods for a bassoonist are kind of just waiting for other sections to get clinicked. And I don't blame the director for needing to do that in order to get the music up to snuff. But like, what if the bassoonist felt almost like obligated to show their musicianship and maybe even to lead or cue something? I think that sets all of us up to be able to play any musical role, which prepares us for whatever piece is in the future, maybe where that's thrown at us. Yeah, and it starts us down a more creative path.
It's such an interesting point. I love that idea of, okay, in your band, essentially pull out a small ensemble,
Yeah.
and then here, you guys perform it. And I'm guessing what you're also suggesting is there is not a conductor.
Yeah.
And so in a large ensemble, yeah, you probably can't do it without a conductor in most situations. Uh, so we've all learned to be so reliant on that skill then of not having that conductor is so important, even when you have a conductor, because now you, to your point, you are listening for those other things, you are paying attention to those other parts, which is so crucial then to the whole ensemble.
Yeah, and it helps the conductor too, right? Like it actually gives something to the conductor for them to work with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a fascinating point. All right, so that's a wonderful takeaway here. I think so. Let's talk a little bit about arranging. So, specifically for the Breaking Winds, I mean, you are essentially all arranging these.
Mhm.
In WindSync, or is there arranging done in house or?
Yes, we don't stick exclusively to in-house arrangements because there are a lot of wind quintet arrangements in the world, and some of them are absolutely amazing. So we do some from around the world. In particular, lately we're playing arrangements by an Israeli bassoonist, Mordecai Reckman, who's in his 90s now and just a like pillar of wind chamber music. But we also have in-house arrangements, and it's kind of like the Breaking Winds, where if you want to arrange, you can arrange. In WindSync, we don't all want to arrange. Mostly, the arrangements that we play are mine or our oboist Emily Ties. But everyone kind of has and does arrange, and that that ultimately works better for us usually than playing someone else's arrangement, honestly. We feel a lot more confident just making changes on the fly to create our own version if the arranger is standing there. And we feel more confident that like we're giving, an interpretation that actually serves the arrangement, which is, that's important. You want your audience to feel like you're really convicted about the music you're playing.
So, what maybe tips, tricks do you have for a teacher or a student who is doing something for a small ensemble? I mean, those points that you made, I think, are really important. Like, these are the things we can do once we have the arrangement in front of us and we've worked through
Mhm.
it. But any thoughts, of the before that happens, like as you're doing the arrangement, if you're a band director and I'm going to create, a wind quintet, what should I be thinking about if I'm going to do the arrangements?
Yeah, I think part of the question is like, is this experience really meant to be a teaching tool? Is it meant to be, is this just like the vehicle through which students are just getting a grip on making their own creative decisions musically? What is it for? Because I actually think most arrangements are too hard for all of us, including for WindSync. Um, so, honestly, like keeping the level pretty low key just so that people get used to talking to each other musically, I think is actually important. But let's say that you have like a bassoon trio on your campus. That's amazing. I know that's unusual, so that would be really exciting. In the bassoon trio, there are a few things that you can grab onto. One is you can learn to play different musical roles even in a trio. So maybe the bass line, the melody, and inner voices are actually exchanged at various points within the arrangement. So in the Breaking Winds, that's what we do. If we were all stuck on one part for 5 minutes, we would probably all have our chops kind of stuck in a rut. Especially the person playing the highest tenor register music might get really tired by the end of the piece, because chamber music has fewer bars of rest. So for us, swapping is a practical thing. For a student, I can see it being both practical and really like interesting. You're learning when to come out. You're learning when to support. You're learning when you really have to have good rhythmic grounding so that the piece stays together and doesn't phase. So that's one thing I would say is varying the roles of the members of the ensemble. Um, Another thing to think about when you're arranging a piece of music is, what are my instruments? Think about, hey, if I'm playing an unusual collection of instruments like the wind quintet, maybe the French horn wants to be loud. How can I either exploit that by giving it a melody or challenge my French horn player to play soft in a certain area? But what am I going to do to counter that? So thinking about like the balance between different instruments naturally is pretty awesome. For instance, the bassoon in a wind quintet is actually very present because it's usually playing bass lines. So my bass lines are richer and louder than, for instance, a bass line even on a French horn, which you wouldn't think would be the case, just thinking about the natural qualities of the instruments. Lastly, I would say that, classical music is pretty easy to arrange in the sense that you can just look at a score and then put line by line down onto a piece of sheet music. One of my favorite things is choral music because wind instruments breathe just like singers do. And so this type of music usually works really well for our instruments. It can be quite beautiful. While it's not technical, it's very rewarding harmonically. But music from the radio is infinitely adaptable to our instrument and a lot of fun to play. Music from the radio is groovy, so it can give us practice reading syncopations. It is often easier technically in the sense that you aren't having like crazy runs in a piece of pop music usually. And so I actually recommend that for younger players too. If you have a player who's ready to go with transcribing things, that would be a great challenge, a song from the radio.
Yeah, I think those are all fantastic tips, and it's kind of like it's okay to not pick the hardest piece off the shelf and try to work through that. One thought I was having as you were saying that I think a great starting place for a teacher who wants to have their students get involved in this is they, even if they're not a bassoon player, they take your music and they also take the sheet music that will be coming out with it. And now they're looking at it. And again, it doesn't matter if they're a bassoon player, right? They can identify exactly what you're talking about. Why are we switching between the first bassoon versus the second bassoon playing these parts here? Because first bassoon doesn't mean it's the hardest part, right? In what you're doing, because you're switching. That could be a wonderful foundation. And also what the Breaking Winds doing is fun stuff. So it's, they're just going to enjoy, the music that was on this latest album. I mean, they're going to enjoy, I think, doing that, and then go look at the music video that's attached to it and have some fun with it. So this was really interesting, Kara. Thanks for taking a deep dive with us and providing some, I think, some really good tips for music teachers out there.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I hope to hear all the new trios and quartets all across Pennsylvania.
That's right. All right. So tag the Breaking Winds and WindSync in your social media posts when you do that. Yeah. And we certainly hope to see the Breaking Winds back at a PMEA conference sometime in the future so people can experience this in person.
That would be fabulous. We honestly still talk about the audience when we went to that in-person conference. That was nuts. So yeah, would love to be back.
Yeah, we'll definitely get you on the schedule again soon. Kara, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us on this edition of PMEA's Take Note podcast. We want to thank our sponsor, the Grove City College Department of Music. We will see you next time.